Let's look at Gochara Jyotish, the Jyotish of countries, governments, economies, and the country's inhabitants and their thoughts and health. Something big always happens when one of the slow-moving planets, the grahas, like Rahu, changes signs. That will happen on March 17th. And this will bring big changes for you and for our nation. Today is February 10th, 2022, depending upon when I get this thing edited. Rahu is now in the sign of Rishabh, Taurus. So for the past year and a half, it has had 3 times its usual power. Taurus gives it that power, for better or worse, depending on the factors in your chart. Rahu will return to its normal power on March 7th. In its present position in Taurus, our country has a Trump problem, a pandemic problem, a Ukraine-Russia problem, a global warming problem, economic problems, and so forth. A China problem. All of this at the same time. Rahu is the most destructive planet, the most destructive graha, I should say, because the Sun, Moon, Rahu, and Ketu are not planets. And graha means grip. These grahas that are out there in space are also within us, in our consciousness. And they grip or control our thinking, our emotions, our behavior, to a certain degree. But Rahu, Ketu, and the Sun and Moon, and the planets all have an effect on us. There are 9 graha used in Jyotish. The outer planets are considered beyond the Himalayas, too far away to be significant. Rahu represents, among other things, viruses and pandemics. Rahu is now in Vrishabh, Taurus, which is the 6th house of the United States. The 6th house is the house of viruses and pandemics, just as Rahu is. And Rahu has also been casting its rays onto the 2nd house of the United States, harming the economy for the past year and a half. See how they're tied together? On March 17th, Rahu will move into Mesh, Aries, which is the 5th house of the United States, and that is the house of Purva Punya, big return of karma. Remember that the United States is still in Rahu Dasha, an 18-year period when Rahu dominates your life, or the life of the nation, or whatever has a birth time. And this new transit will allow Rahu to cast its rays onto the 1st house of the United States, the most important house, which sums up everything that goes on in this country. It contains everything about the country. Rahu, during the last 1.5-year period, has been casting its influence onto our nation's 10th house of power in the world, down here in the corner. It's also the house of Congress and law and order. This is why we had the January 6th invasion of the Capitol and the breakdown of law and order. On March 17th, when Rahu changes signs, it will go into the 5th house. The 5th house represents the economy, worries of the people, and nations that depend on us, like Ukraine, which I'll get into a little later. There in the new sign, Rahu will cast its influence onto the 1st house of the United States, the most important house. And since Ketu is always opposite Rahu, Ketu will be in our nation's 11th house. That's another house of pandemics that will be afflicted by Ketu, which is another graha of pandemics. These two will be working together to strengthen the viruses. And for Trump, Rahu will enter his 9th house of good fortune and ruin that good fortune. And at the same time, it will lose that 6 times power of Rahu there, because he has Rahu there at birth, where it is now. So he has Rahu return right now. So that means 2 Rahus in that sign. So instead of having 3 times Rahu power, which he was born with, he now has 6 times that power. That has already begun with his destruction of evidence recently and his inciting of the riot of January 6th. And Rahu will cast its rays onto his 1st house when it changes signs, the house that sums up his whole life. That's not good for him. And his 5th house of Purva Punya, big return of karma. A Rakshasa, a demon, always incarnates on earth at the end of Kali Yuga in order to prevent the ascension of the golden age of Satyuga. Along with our Trump troubles, Russia is bringing troops and weapons to the border of Ukraine. Russia has been wanting to annex Ukraine for decades. We have sanctions against Russia, so they want Ukraine's 4th house. The 4th house rules natural resources and mining. Russia already has huge resources of oil and sells cheap oil to Europe. Hence this pipeline to Germany that has to go through Ukraine. On March 17th, Rahu will move into Ukraine's 4th house of natural resources, the 5th house for the United States. Rahu will be casting its rays onto Ukraine's 12th house, the house of destruction or endings, or foreign lands, like Russia. On MSNBC a few days ago, Colonel Steve Ganyard said that it will take the Russians another couple of weeks to get all of the troops that they need on the border of Ukraine in order to invade it. That's an estimate, and that's only a few days away from Rahu changing signs and making the Ukraine vulnerable for a year and a half. Many experts on Russia are speculating that Russia is saber-rattling to get us and NATO to end our sanctions against Russia. Economist Richard Wolff agrees. Biden says, if the Russians invade Ukraine, our nation will increase sanctions against them in ways they've never seen. That should concern Russia and maybe hold them at bay. We had 8,000 troops in Eastern Europe And Biden just sent 3,000 more to Ukraine or its vicinity last week. So now we have 11,000 troops there. And we are selling the Ukraine weapons. In transits, all 9 of the Graha actually start to affect the sign. They approach a little early. That's why Russian troops have already placed themselves near the border of Ukraine. And that is evidence Russia's influence is already harming the upcoming sign of Mesh, Aries, the 5th house of the United States, and the other houses as well. Just because it's getting close to the sign, it hasn't even entered the sign. When Rahu moves into Mesh on March 17th, it directs its effects onto the 12th house of endings and death for Ukraine. And that is also the 1st house of the United States, by the way. And the 4th house for Ukraine is also security, love, peace, fulfillment, all good things in life. But Rahu being there is not good for either of our countries. But this is what we have to accept in the world's phase transition. It's not going to suddenly get better through electing a new president, and we are not going to eliminate the Republican Party or the Trump cult, the Trump Party. There are no political solutions during a phase transition. So we just wait for Satyug. It won't be long. As Charlie Lutz said, when the chaos begins, the important thing is don't give in to fear.